Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Porpatich, pulmonary critical care medicine physician, retired Army, and director of the Center for Military Medicine Research here at the University of Pittsburgh. And it's a genuine pleasure to welcome a friend and colleague from the Military Medical School, Uniformed Services University for the Health Sciences, Dr. David Benedek. David is a friend and colleague who has been in the Army for over 30 years and recently retired. He's the chair for psychiatry at the Military Medical School and is an active participant in a Pitt Carnegie Mellon project here at the Collaboratory of Hate in collaboration with Dr. Lisa Nelson and Dr. Michael Kenny. We're delighted to have David not only as a co-investigator on one of our research projects, but here today to share his experience and extremism in the US military. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Benedek, and I again appreciate everyone online and everyone here in the audience for Dr. Benedek's presentation. David?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Porpatich. Thank you. Thanks first to Dr. Porpatich, to Lisa, to Mike, to the GISPIA fellows. I hope I said that right about your program, for inviting me. I'll just make one minor correction. It's the Collaboratory Against Hate. I want to be on the record here. It's that we're against hate in this collaboratory, and I'm glad to be a part of it. As Dr. Porpatich said, I'm the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at USIS, which is the military medical school in Bethesda. I happen to have graduated from there, and then the deal was you could, go there for free if you did 7 years in the Army. And I just stuck around for an entire career. And I was lucky enough to meet Ron when I was an intern, and he was a pulmonary critical care fellow at Walter Reed. So I've known him for a long time, and I've really been made to feel welcome here with the rest of the group in the CAH. And I'm glad to be here. Let's see if I can advance my slides down here. There we go. Yeah, that's the place, the Military Medical School. It's on the campus of what's Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. We're sort of in the corner. It used to be a golf course where they built the school. I'm sure Dr. Porpatich somewhat has mixed feelings about that, given his history with golf, but it's a great institution. I'm happy to be there. And I'll just start by saying that, I was in the military for a long time. I'm recently retired, and I still work at the university, but I'm here representing my own ideas and attitudes, and not necessarily those of the DoD or any other branch of the US government. I have 40 or so slides, and I've been through a few of them, and I know that the format here is to try to allow some time for question and answers, and I'm happy to do that. And I hope if I'm going too long, Jamie will maybe just give me the hook, and I'll know it's time to have questions, because I can stop at different points. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about the challenges related to sort of studying extremism, related to terms and definitions and policies. Try to explain for a little while some of the origins of extremist ideologies and behaviors within some members of the US military and veteran populations, recognizing that it's challenging to understand these origins, and for some reasons that I'll hope to describe. Talk a little bit about perpetuating factors and some of the prevalent problems, understanding just how big a problem we're dealing with, and then talk about recent recommendations regarding mitigation strategies or prevention strategies. And those are the goals for today. We'll see what we can do. So just to start with, a definition of extremism is the holding of extreme political, religious, or ideologic views. Well, we got a challenge already, because extreme and what constitutes extreme is not clearly defined, and really is impacted a little bit by current and evolving social and political values and societal things. So one man's extreme is another one's a little bit either side of moderate. So it's a challenging term. And it's certainly a challenging term when we're trying to quantify over time the history of extremism, where what is extreme may vary over time. Extremist behavior would be, at least it has been defined as efforts to rally or publicly advocate for or recruit into organizations that espouse extreme beliefs. And at least from the FBI's standpoint, they've gone so far as to describe domestic violent extremist as a person within the United States who seeks to further their ideological goals wholly or in part through unlawful force or violence. And so mere having or even mere advocating for ideological positions or even the use of strong rhetoric does not constitute violent extremism. If you can think violent thoughts, you can even advocate, but that isn't the stuff of violent extremism, at least according to the FBI. So you see some of the trickiness here. The DoD has a policy. It's DoD instruction 1325.06, which was until very recently, had been most recently updated in 2012. And it says essentially that military folks can't actively advocate supremacist, extremist, or criminal gang doctrine, ideology, or causes, including those that advocate, encourage, or advocate illegal discrimination based on race, creed, color, sex, religion, ethnicity, national origin, or those that advance the use of force, violence, or criminal activity, or otherwise advance efforts to deprive individuals of their civil rights. So the military talked about extremism as sort of advancing or advocating for discriminatory or violent practices related to discriminatory widespread behavior. Oops, hit the wrong button there. The policy went on to say that it was the duty of the military member to reject participation in extremist activities, which was included, but wasn't limited to fundraising for, or donating to, or demonstrating, or rallying for, or recruiting, or training for the organizations previously noted, or knowingly wearing gang colors, clothing, or tattoos. And the policy, at least as it was drafted and revised in 2012, sort of put a lot of responsibility on military commanders for looking out for and being vigilant to activities that could evolve into extremist behavior, and suggest mechanisms for military commanders to investigate those things and then counsel and offer reprimands for violations of the policy, and really puts a lot of responsibility on commanders in saying, hey, you commanders are supposed to look out for and sort of sniff out what might become extremism or extremist activity, and counsel service members to try in an effort to prevent it. Challenging stuff. So, and I'll talk about the reasons for this. The policy was relatively recently updated about a year and change ago, in the spring of 21, which further defined active participation, and says active participation in extremist activities means the following, except if it's part of an undercover operation, for example: advocating or engaging in the use of threat or unlawful force, advocating for or providing material support, knowingly communicating information. And the policy starts to talk about tweeting and retweeting, posting. I put liking. I'm not sure that it goes so far as to say liking, but there are, within the policy, are prohibitions about sharing information through media, which were never in the policy prior to 2021. Recruiting or training, fundraising, leadership role, actively demonstrating or attending meetings. So a little bit more sort of refining of what constitutes active participation. And then goes on to further define active extremist activities. And there's some overlap here, but advocating or engaging in force, supporting terrorism within the United States, overthrow of the US government or any of its political subdivisions, advocating that personnel, including US contractors or Coast Guard members, to violate US laws. And then again, widespread unlawful discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including pregnancy, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So a sort of broadened anti-discriminatory aspect of what constitutes active participation in extremist activities. And that happened in 2021. And we'll talk a little bit about why. I guess sort of the take home from this is that there's federal law and there's DoD policy that sort of attempt to balance constitutionally protected freedoms of thought and expression with attempts to restrict conduct that infringes on the rights of others. And it's the conduct, it's the behavior, it's the activity that the DoD has chosen to emphasize in its current efforts to sort of prevent and mitigate against the spread of extremism. So this, and if we get into the policy again, the military's pretty general about excluding or prohibiting behavior that is contrary to the good order, morale, and discipline of a unit, because all of that is felt to be able to diminish mission effectiveness. And so the military has generally written policies about behavior that erodes mission capability, and that seems still to be sort of within the sort of intent of the DoD as they go forward in making efforts to combat extremism or extremist activity. So let's see if this will work. You know, I talked about sort of 21 as sort of the beginning of things here. I'm trying, let's see, there we go. We got sort of invigorated in the DoD about being aware of and vigilant towards extremism when we had a new Secretary of Defense, who's our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was appointed shortly after January 6th in the spring of 21. And he, one of his first orders of business was to order a stand down, which is a military term for sort of pause of everything and let's focus on something of immediate military importance. So he had a stand down on extremism. And I have a sort of, everybody in the DoD heard, and there were probably limited exceptions, but almost everybody in the DoD within a couple of weeks of this, his order, heard this little talk. And then that was sort of set the grounds for a unit level discussion. And that was first effort at, hey, we got a problem that we should be dealing with now. So I'll just try to play it for you. It's a couple, like I said, it's about 4 minutes. Oops, that didn't work. I'll try it again. If it doesn't work, it doesn't seem to want to play. I'll give it one more shot and then I'll give you the point. I'm sorry. We didn't get to rehearse this piece of things and I will not paraphrase our Secretary of Defense, but I'll try to give you what I got from hearing his 4-minute intro, and I'll certainly give you what I got from our subsequent unit level discussion. First, the vast majority of military members don't hold extremist beliefs and don't engage in extremist behavior. And that's a sort of a recurrent theme that you'll hear in my presentation, but also in the research to date. We're not talking about large swaths of the military or veteran populations. Most swore to uphold took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and most comported their behavior with that, but some do. And military involvement in extremism, although it became a focus of attention after January 6th, is not a new thing. And I'll try to get to some of that in a moment or two too. What he felt was new, and to some extent was true, is that the capacity of extremism to propagate within society and within the military has really evolved with the evolution of social media and the sort of capacity for information to spread, not just by word of mouth, but rapidly through various networks, some of which are not necessarily sort of publicly accessible, but can be targeted. And he talked a little bit about that. And then his last thought was that we really should do something new since we have this problem, and we should spend some time and efforts to try to figure out how best to combat this. And that was his message to all of us in the DoD. And I'll get to what he sort of heard. And he said, and oh, by the way, when you think about this, we want to hear back from you what you think we should do about it. And so that sparked conversations that we had in small unit kind of level discussions about, what is this and what isn't this? And there were slides reviewing the policy that I've shared with you, the previous policy. And I'll come back to sort of what else sprang from those discussions that was fed back to Secretary Austin. But I'll also try to cover some of the history of extremism. And remember, Lloyd Austin said, this isn't new. And he even said, I've experienced this in my time in the military. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, as sort of a sampling of this, what Dr. Kathleen Bilu said in her book, Bring the War Home, which was published in 2018. And so certainly before January of the January 6th thing that Lloyd Austin was concerned about. But but her sort of discussion in that book, and she's a historian at at the time that she wrote the book at, I believe, University of Chicago, was really about the origins of the white power movement, which is not, and as she describes it, is not one extremist ideology, not one sort of piece of the pie, but a sort of a complex social movement that brought together members of the Klan, various militias, tax resistors, white nationalists, white separatists, neo-Nazis, skinheads, various extremist, if we even without a true definition, extremist ideologies, and sort of united their efforts. Some of whom, the people she talks about in her book, were activists and proponents, and others certainly committed acts of violence that the FBI says are violent extremism from a law enforcement standpoint, and that the DOD is also increasingly concerned with acts of extremist violence. Without cheating and looking at the website, do people recognize this person? Yeah, this is Louis Beam. Louis Beam was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. I think he flew, he was a gunner. He wasn't a helicopter pilot. I apologize. It was the 25th Aviation Battalion. He flew an awful lot of missions, mostly, transporting the dead and the injured. But as a gunner, he secured the perimeter so those helicopters could land and take those people. And during his military, in his own writings, he said he killed anywhere from a dozen to over 50 communists. And he came back from Vietnam in '68. He basically became a leader of what the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Texas. And really, according to Dr. Bilu, is sort of a founding father of the white power movement. And I'll explain that a little more as we go. But, what Dr. Bilu says, and which is really still true, is that this is a movement, but it's a kind of, in some ways, a movement that's hard to study because the people involved, for obvious reasons, they try to hide their activities at times. They use things like secret roll lists, just like the KKK did. And then they're sort of, they utilize, and in no small part to Louis Beam's credit, if that's the word, self-style organization. They are loosely associated, but try to sort of keep their actual connections in the shadows. Sometimes they, for political reasons, would state our memberships are huge. Sometimes they'd say less. Journalistic accounts of the actions of this group varied in terms of their the motives of reporters at times to sort of whether they believed perhaps in some of the activities or wanted to sweep them under the rugs, didn't necessarily describe accurately the way things were connected, at least, and Dr. Bilu's research, the book, Bring Home the War, Bring the War Home it's pretty compelling reading for a history book. And it has a lot of footnotes. It's half footnotes, like a good history book, I guess. But it really documents sort of the way these groups connect with one another, and really Louis Beam's leadership and innovation in terms of that process. And again, just like journalists, there were law enforcement communities that reported things, and part of the problem with this is that there's no necessarily a standard of how to report these kind of activities in investigations, and so kind of going back through history is tricky to get accurate accounts. And of course, there are watchdog groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and others and they also have sort of maybe motives with regard to accuracy and the challenges of reporting this stuff. So it's not an easy history to unravel. But having said all that, I'll give you what Dr. Bilu kind of says. She basically says that in the aftermath of Vietnam, in the aftermath of Vietnam, a narrative evolved in our culture that and it resonated with some, and certainly not all veterans, but in some veterans, that the government betrayed our service members by sending us to fight communists and not allowing us time or resources to win, brought us back and left us to be disrespected by our fellow countrymen. So sent us on a noble task, betrayed us, didn't let us win it, and brought us back where we got spat on. And you know, we've all heard that narrative, and some pieces of it are probably historically accurate, and some are not. But out of that sort of disgruntled, felt betrayed military contingent birthed the white power movement. You know, she traces sort of the development of white power, and as I said, Louis Beam was a Klansman, and if you think initially about the Klan, at least how they viewed themselves, were vigilantes upholding the state's values, right? You know, if you think about the origins of the Klan and the Civil War, we're fighting to maintain the old South way of doing things. And vigilantism was sort of a part of white power movement until at some point in the early 80s, where it sort of pivoted to we're really fighting against the state and advocating for state overthrow. And so that was the direction that things traveled. It started with resentment and bitterness against the state, and we'll finish the job of doing the things that the military sent us out to do. And we're going to eradicate communism, and we're going to, you know, make the world, the U.S., what it should be. And it sort of pivoted over time to, hey, the government's not going to do this. We have to do this. And I, you know, again, I can't in a few sentences summarize Dr. Bilu's efforts, but I'm trying here. Anybody, how about this guy? Anybody know who he is? No, so I didn't give you a cheating here. So this is Randy Weaver. Randy Weaver, another military veteran who came back from Vietnam a couple years after, actually, was at Fort Bragg, never made it to Vietnam, if I recall correctly, but left the military and moved back to his home area, sort of in Idaho, got a farm. He claimed he wasn't a racist. He was a white separatist. And he took up residence on a big farm, an outpost in Idaho at Ruby Ridge. He associated with Klans people. He associated with the Aryan Nation. They were in the neighborhood where he worked and lived. He wore I think a white power shirt, and he had a Aryan Nation belt buckle. He got involved in, he lived on a compound with his family, and they were gun people. His kids, his adopted kid, the children, they all carried weapons wherever they went. And he was willing to sell sawed-off shotguns to folks that were bona fide members of extremist organizations that he associated with. And he said, at one point, he said, I'll do that to what turned out to be an FBI informant. He was served with a warrant for, you know, illegal arms sales. He was released and said, you know, told to report back for his arraignment and he didn't show up. He later said it was because he got the wrong date, but it wouldn't have mattered. He wasn't going to do it anyway. Right. So he and his family were holed up at Ruby Ridge, and the FBI knew it and the ATF knew it, and it got to be big news in the early 90s, 92. I think this was 91, 92. And darn if they set up a roadblock and they surveilled him. And meanwhile, the Aryan Nation, his neighbors, and some from outside drove to the area and protested. And it was a big news event when the ATF or the FBI accidentally finally shot and killed his wife And she was a very fundamentalist religious person and believed that the apocalypse was coming. So there were sort of commingling of extremist, if you will, views. But she became sort of a martyr. He surrendered. He was eventually, I think, spent a little time for failure to report for his court date, but didn't get significant prison time, and he was sort of seen as a evidence by these groups of the state overreaching, right, and sort of fueled subsequent. We got to do something. The state is infringing on our rights as separatists to think our thoughts, to do our own thing, and he was sort of a martyr in this movement, and. Yeah, so he's another military veteran who's associated, and the challenge of Ruby Ridge and the challenge of Waco, another sort of government standoff with folks with extremist views, religious ones, David Koresh. These were viewed as sort of events that fed into this. The government is not on our side, and helped sort of foster this pivot against the government. And again, I would refer folks to Dr. Belu's book. And she talks about really throughout this, the number of these people, Louis Beam, Randy Weaver, Richard Butler, with whom Randy Weaver associated, who founded the Aryan Nation, Eric Rudolph, whom you remember blew up the Olympic Center in Atlanta, and blew up some abortion clinics along the way too. And then Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols and Michael Fortier, who all met in the military, and of course were unfortunately responsible for ultimately the blowing up of the Murrah Federal Building, which Dr. Belu cites as sort of the greatest moment of the violent ripple effects of extremism in her tale, which ends around 2015. But and they also read the Timothy McVeigh in particular was very well versed in the writings of Louis Beam, of Randy Weaver, and had his writings in his car when he was found. So you sort of see this history of members of the military, in generally after the fact, being sucked in or becoming leadership in extremist and violent extremist behavior. And then, although not mentioned in Dr. Belu's book, there's a Private Meltzer who actually joined the military and then communicated with his friends in the Order of Nine Angels in sort of trying to develop a conspiracy to actually communicate about deployment, to sort of orchestrate a mass casualty event on his own base. And of course, Nidal Hassan, a military member who was responsible for the Fort Hood shootings. And so there's a sort of long history of veterans and some history of active actual military people being perpetrators of extremist violence. Again, it's important to note that at least per Dr. Belu, and history would suggest she's right, that the white power movement in particular relies on this cell-style organization. They are sort of a loose association of individuals who think not entirely the same way, but sort of ultimately believe in violence as a mechanism to affect change at some level, to sort of create a new order where white people are in charge of a country. I've mentioned sort of the things that she talked about, and I mentioned the Waco and Ruby Ridge and Oklahoma City, and she sort of concludes her book with a mention of Dylan Roof, who was the shooter at the Bible study in South Carolina, who never had any contact with any of these people, but was aware of their efforts and their writings and their thinkings through his internet surfing, and in a lot of ways, sort of is exactly what Louis Beam seemed to envision, with sort of his notion that an army of single small operators, nobody needs to give them an order, they'll know what to do. So it's a kind of a scary but fascinating history. The takeaways, much like Secretary Austin, extremism is not new and certainly not new to the military. The organizations have been led by and they covet military members because they have tactical knowledge. They know how to carry out acts of violence and know how to operate covertly. The movement is a sort of leveraging of some social fractures or tensions and evolves over time. And marginalized populations, disgruntled veterans, those in transition from active duty may be ripe for involvement. And the folks that I've mentioned generally left the military, the ones that I mentioned generally left the military and then pursued further action. There have been military members who've been actually forced to leave because of distributing racist materials, but they're few and far between. But that's the stuff of her sort of where we're at, and I think she's on track. And I would just this is a quote from Louis Beam from 1992. Participants in a program of leaderless resistance through phantom cell must know exactly what they are doing and how to do it. Organs of information distribution, such as newspapers, leaflets, computers, etc., which are widely available to all, keep each person informed of events, allowing for a planned response that will take many variations. No one need issue an order to anyone. So this is a he wrote this in 92. He was thinking this certainly before then. And I think he's credited also with establishing, long before social media was popular, an encrypted network of computers, the Liberty Net, where he distributed materials such as his writings and the writings of others. So, we know the military is part of this, and veteran populations are part of this, but how much? And this is where things get a little more murky. The House staff majority released a report recently that suggested, first, like everyone before them has said, that the vast majority of military folks are not, and veterans are not involved in military or in domestic violent extremism. That's just not the case. There's 18 million veterans. They're not they're part of this, but they're not by any means the problem. That having been said, their numbers are growing, in the last 30 or so years, they've been people with military backgrounds have been responsible for the death, they say, of 314 people and the injury of closer to 2,000 in this country. And then the average number of military people involved in acts of violence, say and this print is probably small there, but say from 1990 up to 2000 was relatively small, 7 per year, but since that time it's grown considerably to closer to 30. So that it's a small but perhaps growing problem within the military and veteran populations, and that the number of since 2015, the number of veterans, the percentage of involvement has also increased. So again, sort of tagging along with what Secretary Austin said, this is not a new problem. This is not a huge problem, but it is a growing problem and one that we should be increasingly trying to understand. From the report, I think it's important that then there was expert testimony from a number of researchers on this issue. There's no standard single pathway towards extremism. There are certain risk factors, including social isolation, job insecurity, unhealed trauma, substance use, mental health concerns, and think about, the veteran population, think about the military population, that might make some people susceptible to radicalization in the sort of vision of Mr. Beam, and that the House's idea was that really part of the solution is peer support and developing support from other veterans to serve as a way to minimize or mitigate against isolation, against disillusionment, against betrayal, and to sort of reality check those those persons that might be at the time of transition vulnerable to radicalization. And one more figure from our military history. People, I see at least one person nodding their head in the back recognizes this gentleman. That's Tim McVeigh. And that was the police sketch of the person that drove the Ryder truck that was seen leaving the scene, not in the Ryder truck, that led to his, the APB that led to his arrest really relatively shortly afterwards. And like I said, in his car were all the pieces of the writings of past extremist white power leaders, if you will, that influenced him. And in his own sort of discussions and interviews, he's acknowledged that he was fueled by Waco and Ruby Ridge, and he sort of fed that to his colleagues, Mike Fortier and Terry Nichols, who helped him obtain the materials and develop the bomb that he used to, blow up the federal building in 1995, which was among the largest domestic, it is the largest domestic terrorism event in this country's history, and was sort of represents, and I think Dr. Ballou makes this point, large number of people killed, but then the ripple effects are even the number of, children without parents, grieving spouses, and the sort of the societal impact is greater than even the casualties that were created by this event. Okay, what about preventing this? What about mitigating this? What about what Secretary Austin said? What should we do? Well, again, at the testimony in the hearings that led to the House's report, Dr. Horgan, who's a Georgia professor, said, part of this is better screening of violent extremist beliefs in the military. We got to ask people if they have these things when they're joining. So that's part of it. And then part of this is developing clear guidelines and procedures for reporting once one has a suspicion or an inkling. Again, remember I said commanders are supposed to counsel, maybe reprimand. It's really, who should we tell? Who should we tell if we're concerned that there are indicators? And that part of things is not clearly articulated by previous policy. But this was testimony about it, I think also about a year ago, that led to this report from the House staff. What else do you say? Well, you got to make known the consequences. People need to know there are going to be some punishment or consequences for involvement in these activities and participation. And so to the extent that we want to prevent future ones, he says, yes, peer-based interventions are important. And the more we see veterans who become involved in extremism, we'll also see veterans who can be part of the solution. And he talked a little bit and introduced the notion, I think, of off-ramping, of giving veterans a way out once they've sort of started to wind down this path. And he believes that veteran peer support, because, unit cohesion and military culture is one of sort of trusting your buddies, that really military peers are part of the solution. And then he recognized, like others, that somewhere in the mix of vulnerability is exposure to trauma and unresolved, whether that's pre-military or during military. Better treatments for trauma-related mental health disorders are probably part of the solution as well. Okay, so the House did their report, and Rand also came up with a couple of reports. And what did Rand say about preventing or mitigating or combating military extremism? Well, one, engage the larger community. And I mean, part of our collaboratory here is an effort, I think, for the larger community to share information with the military and to gain from the military. They believed in a community-based approach. They sort of wanted, Rand says, hey, there's some existing programs in place that can be leveraged. There can be some touch points that might be part of the solution, the chaplaincy, mental health clinics, other aspects of military culture that can be part of detecting, preventing different pieces. And then, of course, some efforts to do a better job of sharing information and leveraging automated intelligence and data to sort of look for new trends and further quantify the scope of the problem. One more who's who here. Anybody know this guy? So this is Lieutenant Colonel Reservist Leonard Grippo. He was among the first. He was a reservist, but a active military member in that sense, who was convicted for his involvement in January 6th. He was actually a medic. And a physician's assistant, I believe, and was in practice, I think, in New Mexico, but he flew to support the president, he said, and got caught up in things, but was in the Capitol and has been convicted and I think sentenced at this point for his participation in the events of January 6th. Another RAND report, there were two, and I put the titles here, but again, this one was talking about sort of the notion of dividing early phase intervention, sort of primary prevention being education and training at touch points. Middle phase would be sort of finding off roads for those that may be on their way down the pathway to participation in domestic violence and extremism. And then a late phase being efforts to ultimately to redirect and then to prevent through the leveraging of intelligence. Oops, I got all their recommendations to continue to look more deeply at this, seek to understand how extremism manifests itself in the military, and seek to understand in-unit dynamics that are related. What's going on at the military level that might perpetuate this during or after military service, and of course, more research. Back to Secretary Austin. What came back to him from the stand down is we've had this discussion. We see that this might be a growing problem, as you suggested. You should commission a working group to act on this. You know, we agree with you. This is a problem, and he did. And the first thing that happened as a result of the working group's recommendations was the updated DoD policy, which said these things are extremist activities, and this constitutes active participation. Arm command with some more guidance as to what's verboten. They also implemented, when you leave the military, there's a thing called transition assistance program. Everybody that leaves is entitled to participate and is encouraged to participate. And it's where you get guidance about how to get civilian health care insurance, or what your retirement benefits will be, or how to file a disability claim, or how to polish up your resume so that you might get a job when you get out. And it's really pragmatic and practical guidance about sort of leaving the military. And as a result of this working group, there in the current rendition of the TAPS program, there is discussion about the fact that you may well find yourself being recruited by extremist organizations, and that remember the oath that you swore yourself you would uphold, and remember your values, and sort of and again, it's in its infancy, this training, but at least a warning, heads up, this could happen to you, so be alert. They took the working group took a look at entry-level questionnaires. Said, what do we do when we're assessing people to join the military? And said, hey, maybe we should ask some questions about, have you ever? because, there's certainly, as was the case with Louis Beam and others, some bring into the organization some biases and some tendencies that maybe we should think about not accessing to join the military. That's that's tricky, but we can at least ask, so we can maybe get a sort of early thought about people that might be susceptible. And then they said, again, let's start a more organized way to share and register information, because disparate law enforcement agencies, when they investigate these things, what constitutes an indicator. I was reading, I think yesterday, there was a report in the paper about a service member in Fort Lewis, Washington at McCord, who was just charged with theft of a machine gun parts. There's many reasons for buying a machine gun, perhaps, but could one of those be to arm? So what should we think about in terms of potential tipping points, and how can law enforcement agencies sort of share information as part of the ultimate solution? Of course, this costs money, and the commission said, "Hey, find out what parts of the budget should pay for this." That's always part of a working group. Hey, how are we going to pay for this? But also, they recommended better training for both military and civilian touchpoint folks. So, social workers, chaplains, recruiters. What are some of the things to be aware of that we should be perhaps giving pause to? Law enforcement, for that matter, they recommended again. We have that DOD instruction, that policy that says these things are prohibited, but not every commander reads every DOD instruction, but maybe getting some of that language into other policies so it can be more shared, more widespread. So commanders hear, oh, this is stuff that's a no-no in the military. And then also leveraging, as the RAND folks said to do, we have terrorism prevention stuff, and we in the past have been sort of focusing that training on external threats, but why not use the education and the programs that are in place for recognizing, identifying, preventing external terrorist threats to internal ones as well. And those are sort of the work group recommendations that came out of Secretary Austin's commissioning of this working group that continues. And I was going to, how am I doing? Am I okay here? Yeah, I was going to talk just a little bit about some efforts that we are participating in that sort of dovetail with the Collaboratory Against Hate, just briefly as sort of part of the Let's Learn More piece of this. My colleagues at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, and did you spend time there, Dr. Porpatich? I think you did. Yeah, and the Army Public Health Command now have engaged in this product called the BHAT, Behavioral Health Assessment Team. This sprung from OIF when the military sent military behavioral health professionals to the desert, actually, to assess through pen and pencil kind of surveys mental health prevalence of symptoms and exposures to the service members, and it really helped command understand the reality of post-traumatic stress disorder. These were deployed mental health specialists, and I was fortunate enough to go on one of those MHAT missions. And when the war concluded, the military sort of said, hey, this is a good idea. Let's get a pulse on people. And there are different ways to do this. And one of them is through what's now called the Behavioral Health Assessment Team. And originally those were teams that were sent to units, but now technology is being leveraged, and the behavioral health assessment teams utilize surveys to survey broad swaths of the military about a number of topics, usually related to behavioral health. But at about the time that Dr. Porpatich and colleagues sort of got in touch with us, I had met a person at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research who was in charge of this, or point person for this program. And I said, can you maybe get some questions in there about terrorism and engagement? And, he said, that's anonymous. I said, that's fine. And, we want to get people to answer honestly. I said, that's fine. Just ask if they've seen other people do this. That's a starting place. Let's ask, to what degree have you seen or witnessed some of these things that are within the DOD's definition now of extremist behavior and activities. So on the, and I hope I showed you there that the that was sort of phase 3 of this ongoing study. But we got responses now from about 6,000, closer to 7,000 service members who were asked this question. Sometime in the past 3 months, have you witnessed a soldier in your unit engage in any of the following? And then we articulated some of the stuff from the DoD policy. Sometime in the past 3 months, have you witnessed encourage or disobey order, advocate widespread discrimination right out of the DoD's, this is what you're not supposed to do by policy. So we asked those questions. Now, I'm going to end with that teaser because the data is not published yet. My hope is that the data will help us, as the BHAT and as previous BHATs and MHAT have done, convince command to continue the effort to ask more questions and get more color and character to what is happening in the active duty population. And, it's with that spirit that I'm happily and enthusiastically collaborating with the Collaboratory Against Hate, because I think if we ask these kind of questions to a wider audience, we'll learn a little bit more about not just the military and veteran populations, but our society in general. So I think that's just my last slide. Definitions hard. Plenty of examples in the military. Most military folks and veterans aren't part of the problem. It's hard to know the exact history and the exact extent, but we're working on it. And there is some initial guidance in terms of a prevention and mitigation strategy, and happy to be part of that. So I'll stop there. I have my references here. And I've mentioned them, and I think they were cited appropriately. And I have a few minutes for questions, but it's a small audience in the house, so we'll take them. So thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I wanted to just get your opinion on one issue. So I think mostly coming out of the experiences of Germany, there's been rumors in the US that some military extremists, some people are infiltrating the military deliberately to bring extremism into the military, to get weapons training, get weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So if that were the case on a widespread scale, surveys are unlikely to pick those up because those are people who have all the reason in the world not to be honest in a survey.
Sure.
I've never seen much evidence of infiltration, but I'd like to get your read on
Sure.
the extent to which you think that happens in the US versus.
I think, you're picking up part on the problem with understanding the extent is, hey, I'm not going to raise my hand and say, yeah, I'm a proud extremist and infiltrated the military. No one's going to do that. The way the questions are framed is, have you seen anybody else? And as you said, part of this is rumors and information from elsewhere. And there are examples, right? I mentioned Meltzer, who was already a member of the Order of Nine Angels when he joined. So I would say that's beyond rumor to say that some people join with those ties, and perhaps whether this was a, hey, why don't you join the military and then provide, that's a little less clear. But I think my opinion, not based on research, but by example, it would make sense that such organizations would try to infiltrate. It's a reasonable tactic. Let's get some folks on the inside. It makes it easier to understand military movement, and others have who felt betrayed by the military have shared information with our adversaries. So that's not. I think it's part of the problem. How big of part of the problem, I don't know, but it would be, I think, foolish to say no, that doesn't happen. People, it would be wishful thinking. Best I can do, because again, numbers can't help you. Oh, that's good.
Dr. Benedek, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I kind of see the challenge of getting a handle on extremism in the military similar to trying to get a handle on suicide prevention. There are so many factors that go into it. And it seems like with extremism, like suicide, you could have pre-existing behavioral health. You can come into the military with growing up in a family where extremism is condoned, et cetera. So it's really hard to get your hands around ways to prevent it or to really stop it, other than constant vigilance, right? Just constant vigilance, and then training military folks, not only when they come in, but on a continued basis. And I know we do like cold weather training every
Sure.
year, hot weather training, how to prevent injuries from cold and hot weather, et cetera. But
Sure.
is there ongoing training every year required to sort of just the issue of extremism and hate in the military forefront of that military force now?
Sure. So I would say this, at present, there is ongoing how to insider threat training. And there are things that are on the cusp of this, and anti-terrorism training is required every year. And so there are platforms to which additional pieces could be added, and as additional information comes in. There isn't a requirement for anti-extremism training annually. And again, we had the stand down only not even 2 years ago, but the recommendations are, hey, let's build this into, there are lots of platforms for training, and I would imagine that that's what's coming, is and different customized training for entry-level people, for leaders, for law enforcement, for chaplains, ultimately, train for your piece of the fight. And I think the other thing in terms of getting a handle, and you mentioned suicide, there is capacity to be better informed by big data, and by understanding and coming up with sort of rules for what constitutes behavior that should be reported as potentially indicating terrorism. And so as we've done with our Army Stars project, we've linked military data repositories and ongoing surveys to try to create larger pools of data from whence we can make better informed predictions and concentrations of risk. And I think there's a future there for this too. And again, big data isn't the solution to everything, but coupled with training and refining, I think we can refine our perhaps what move some people with these common risk factors towards suicide versus violence in general versus domestic violence, violent extremism. And we're not there yet, but that's kind of the way forward.
So on behalf of all of the great leadership here at Carnegie Mellon and Pitt for the Collaboratory Against Hate, Dr. Benedek, thank you very, very much for taking the time to visit us from Washington, D.C. and to be with us and share your experiences on extremism and hate in the military. And again, just wanted to thank you again for all your great effort, both now as well as your prior 30-year career in the Army. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.